Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, de-globalisation. Recent decades have seen an unprecedented peak of economic global connectedness. But that trend was visibly weakening well before the Covid pandemic. And now many think the coronavirus disaster might put globalisation into reverse. But is that reading correct? And if it is, what does it mean for our prosperity? And what could and should follow globalisation?
Joining us this week is Dani Rodrik, an economist at the Harvard Kennedy School and author of the seminal Globalisation Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy. We also have Penny Goldberg, a professor of economics at Yale University, who was chief economist at the World Bank until March this year. Penny, Dani, welcome to you both.
Hello.
Nice to be with you.
Covid-19 has revealed the vulnerability of supply chains. In the UK, for example, PPE shortages were a massive issue at the beginning of the crisis, as air freight rates soared because of restrictions on passenger travel. But was this evidence that globalisation had gone too far?
Certainly with respect to critical medical supplies, governments would be well advised to stockpile and diversify supplies. That doesn't necessarily mean less globalization. It might mean different sources of supply, propping up some domestic supply chains.
It's remarkable how well supply chains have worked under the circumstances. We're pretty well provided for the most part. Most people experienced shortages in toilet paper, but that had nothing to do with global supply chains. It had to do with the logistics of the distribution system. And of course, you mentioned before, Lizzy, there were problems with PPE. And so this is where this sentiment comes from, that this is where these global supply chains failed us, and this is understandable. So the obvious way to address that in the future would be to have strategic reserves. We have these strategic reserves, for example, for petroleum. As it turns out, we don't have them for food in the United States, and we don't have them for medical equipment or for PPE.
We've had waves since the 19th century of global trade ebbing and flowing, a very fast phase in the 1980s and 90s, and then it's stalled for the past decade after the financial crisis. A lot of people are saying this great wave of globalization has come to an end. What's your view on that fundamental question?
We created imbalances in the world economy with sort of parts of the world economy becoming very integrated and along them with a lot of professionals and corporations and big banks and big tech becoming sort of very closely integrated with each other around the world. But progressively, I would say, becoming disintegrated from their domestic economies.
Do you think we could see sometime in the future another wave of globalization?
There are many areas where I think the benefits of globalization in the sense of global rules, global governance, better global agreements, more global cooperation, those gains have not been reaped yet. Public health, we need a better World Health Organization that can provide better guidance, that can lead a global vaccine effort and can provide for the global public goods in the areas of public health. And obviously, we need much better environmental governance at the global level with respect to climate change.
We saw on the graph earlier that world trade boomed after 1990, in large part because Asian economies were increasing their manufacturing bases and entering the global trading network at scale, and then lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. If globalization does go into reverse, how damaging will that be for the global south?
There is nothing that leads to faster poverty reduction than trading with a richer country. And we saw that happening, in Japan, in most countries in East Asia, actually. Partly it's a victory of the old model of comparative advantage. What these countries were doing was exploiting their comparative advantage in low-skill labor, producing goods very cheaply and selling them to the lucrative export markets of Europe and the United States. In the absence of this path, of this export-driven, export-led growth, it's not clear what path developing countries can take. It's not impossible, but I think it's going to be much harder, and we're not going to see the fast growth we've seen in the past.
We're going to look at a chart. What it shows is how populist parties in Europe have really surged in support over the past 3 decades. Now, Penny, first of all, populists, as you know, in the US often attack multilateral globalist organizations, as they call them, like the World Bank and like the World Health Organization.
In some sense, the WTO became the victim of its own success. It became very large, very diverse, and there was this all or nothing approach. So for anything to happen, all countries had to agree. And they had to vote on entire packages of rules rather than isolated measures. And that led to complete paralysis. So it became an organization that for a while could not accomplish anything.
And on the UK economic nationalism, Brexiteers say that they are simply trying to get back democratic sovereignty from the European Union. Isn't that a perfectly legitimate goal from people in a country to seek?
If you want to reclaim sovereignty, which Brexit was purportedly what it was about, you have to have a good agenda for what you're going to be deploying your sovereignty for. In other words, what's your economic vision? What's your growth plan? What is it that you want to be that the European Union prevents you from becoming? It's a general point there about protection or having higher tariffs or protecting yourself from capital flows and desiring policy space. The question is, those are shields that should protect what you're trying to do for legitimate social and economic purposes. And if you have not specified those things, simply putting up those protectionist barriers or simply leaving the EU isn't going to leave you any better off.